Can you believe that for thousands of years, civilizations thrived where the very air is a weapon, where the ground itself is trying to steal your warmth, and where the closest star feels like it's burning just to mock your shivering existence? We are talking about the year 1400 CE, high in the brutal, unforgiving spine of South America, the Andes Mountains, a place so stunningly beautiful it feels like a cosmic joke, masking a terror beyond imagination. This is not just high altitude. This is the death zone, a merciless frontier where every single sunset was a countdown, a desperate, freezing race against oblivion. Imagine a silent catastrophe that repeats every single night, year after year, claiming lives not with fire or fury, but with the ruthless, crushing silence of the cold and the suffocating absence of oxygen. Tonight, in the deep shadow of the mountain peaks, the air temperature is plummeting toward -30 degrees Celsius, a number that doesn't just mean cold. It means cellular destruction. It means the moisture in your breath instantly crystallizes into tiny, deadly shards of ice that tear at your lungs. It means the thin, precious blood in your extremities slows down until it's molasses, waiting for the mountain to claim those digits, one by one. In the remote village of Qualca, perched impossibly at 14,000 feet, the last rays of the sun have just vanished, dragging the last sliver of warmth and hope with them. The people here, the ancestors of the mighty Inca, are not soft, but they are terrified. They know that once the sun, Inti, leaves them, the mountain mother, Pachamama, turns into a vengeful, icy fury, demanding tribute in the form of human suffering. The threat isn't a jaguar or a rival tribe raiding the slopes. It's the apocalypse of the atmosphere. It's the invisible vacuum of oxygen that leaves children gasping for air, clutching at the thin air that feels like water thinning to vapor. They call it susto de la puna, the fright of the high plains, a paralyzing dread that settles deep in the chest as the first star ignites overhead, each one a pinprick of frozen fury, reminding them how utterly alone they are. Every single structure in Qualca is an architectural prayer against death. Their homes are not built of sturdy timber. Timber does not exist here. They are painstakingly constructed from thick, sun-baked mud bricks, adobe, and massive field stones wrestled from the unforgiving earth, often requiring 3 generations just to complete the foundation. These walls are inches thick, designed not to keep heat in, that battle is already lost, but to slow down the relentless, bone-crushing invasion of the cold. The greatest, most insidious enemy is the wind, the huayra. It screams down the canyons like 1,000 sharpened knives, finding the smallest crack, the tiniest fissure in the mortar, and instantly turning that breach into a lethal blast freezer that can kill a baby in minutes. Old Man Titu, the village elder, whose face is a roadmap of frostbite scars, knows the sound of that wind better than the voice of his own wife. Tonight, the Waira is singing a death song, and it sounds dangerously close. He watches his great-grandson, young Kusi, a boy barely 7 years old, frantically shoving clumps of dried llama dung, the only viable fuel source they have, into the central hearth. This is not a relaxing, cheerful fire. This is a strategic defense maneuver, a desperate, controlled burn that must last until dawn, 8 hours away. That meager, smoky flame is literally the line between life and a frozen, dignified death. Llama dung, or takia, burns fast, smoky, and with pitifully low energy output. Yet it is their most precious resource, collected and guarded with military precision. They have maybe enough to keep the core temperature of this hut from completely collapsing for 6 hours, maybe 7 if Kusi rations it perfectly. After that, they rely purely on the thermal mass of the walls and sheer, stubborn willpower to survive the final, darkest hours. But the takia isn't the only thing running out. The air inside the hut, already stifling and thick with the acrid smell of smoke and unwashed bodies, is being relentlessly depleted of its oxygen by the struggling fire and the clustered family. They must choose between the slow poison of smoke inhalation, which leaves them dizzy and weak, or the swift, brutal execution of the frost if they open the ventilation. It is a choice between 2 terrible ways to die, a choice they make nightly without hesitation. Smoke over ice. Can you believe the sheer, unbelievable engineering of their clothing? Woven from the fleece of the alpaca and the vicuña, creatures designed by the gods to laugh at the cold. These textiles are masterpieces of survival, each thread a layer of protection. They wear layer upon layer, trapping minute pockets of air, creating a microclimate of desperate, borrowed warmth. But even this marvel of ancient technology can only delay the inevitable creeping chill. Now the last act of the day begins. The heavy woven door of the hut, a thick curtain of hide and fiber, is pulled tightly shut and lashed with leather thongs. Every member of the family crowds together, 8 people huddled into an area smaller than a modern closet, pressed tightly on reed mats spread over the hard dirt floor. Every single unit of body heat is precious, pooled into a communal effort to defeat the absolute zero, attempting to consume them from the outside walls inward. Look closer, beyond the smoke and the desperate closeness. See the fear in the mother's eyes, the deep-set lines of permanent exhaustion, as she checks on her baby, wrapped almost completely in wool, the tiny face barely visible. If that child cries, they waste precious energy that must be conserved for metabolism. If that child stops breathing, a silent tragedy, common in the Puna. They may not know until the horrific, gray light of morning reveals the devastating truth. This is not a romantic struggle. This is primal, brutal, and utterly silent combat against the most powerful force on the planet. the relentless, uncaring majesty of the high Andes. And tonight, the mountain is hungry, listening for the quiet gasp of a soul finally succumbing to the cold. Get ready, because the moment the fire dies down, the real terror begins. We are about to dive deep into the impossible history of high-altitude night survival, a 15-chapter journey into desperation. The fire is not merely dying, it is committing suicide. It collapses inward with a final, heartbreaking sigh, and in that instant, the world changes. The flickering golden safety net vanishes, plunging the tiny pirka hut, a fragile shell of rough-hewn stone and mud mortar, into a darkness so profound it feels pressurized, suffocating. This is the signal. This is the moment the mountain wakes up. The air, which had been merely frigid, instantly curdles into liquid ice, dropping not by degrees, but by violent, vengeful increments. Outside, the temperatures plummet routinely to 20 below 0 Celsius, but inside the cramped space, the chilling effect is amplified by the sheer elevation, the altitude itself acting as a catastrophic thermal leech. Survival at 14,000 feet is not a continuous struggle. It is a nightly, 8-hour siege where the body fights an enemy it cannot see, cannot touch, and one that never tires. This is the true horror of the Andes night. The cold does not just lower the mercury, it steals the very breath from your lungs, combining its chilling power with the second, equally lethal assassin, hypoxia. Soroche, the silent killer, stalks the sleeping. Every night, the villagers of this impossible altitude must survive not one, but two simultaneous biological catastrophes. The first is hypothermia, the rapid draining of core heat. The second is the profound systemic lack of oxygen, which cripples the body's ability to fight back. Think about this. Your body's natural defense mechanism against the cold is shivering, a violent, energy-intensive process designed to generate residual heat. But at this altitude, in this era, your blood is already starved of the very fuel, oxygen, needed to power that heat generation.
The great barrel-chested adaptations of the Andean people, the lungs 30% larger, the blood saturated with higher hemoglobin counts, are miraculous, but they are not impervious. They are merely delaying the inevitable confrontation with death, minute by terrifying minute.
The lack of adequate oxygen means the brain slows down, lethargy sets in, and the fight response is tragically muted. The victim, slipping into a hypothermic stupor, often feels strangely comfortable, accepting the long sleep. A terrifying physiological betrayal, unique to extreme elevation. To counteract this dual assault, the villagers rely on a resource more precious than gold: fuel. Not just any fuel, but the meager, slow-burning gifts of the high puna. They hoard the brittle, resinous tola scrub, treating each twig like a diamond. But the true staple, the literal lifesaver, is takia, the hardened, sun-dried dung of their sacred llamas and alpacas. This is the difference between life and death. Llama dung burns slowly, consistently, and without the volatile flare-ups that waste precious energy. The careful, almost religious tending of the dying embers, banked deep under ash, is the most crucial ritual of the day. If the embers are lost, the fire must be painstakingly restarted using friction or carried embers from another dwelling, a desperate, often impossible task in the paralyzed stillness of the deep night. Failure to secure fuel means absolute zero thermal protection. It means relying solely on the architecture of desperation. The low, narrow doorways designed to conserve every molecule of trapped warmth, and the heavy, layered ichu grass roofs. But even the tightest structure cannot withstand the mountain's malevolence. The cold seeps through the poorest stone walls, radiating a bone-deep chill that penetrates layers of woven alpaca wool and vicuña fiber. The family huddles together, a tightly packed thermal core. The oldest and weakest are placed in the center, drawing life from the surrounding, struggling bodies. Shared body heat is not an act of comfort. It is the fundamental physics of survival. Every movement is deliberate, agonizingly slow, because every calorie is a non-renewable resource that must be conserved for the morning's desperate dash for sunlight. The psychological toll of this nightly routine is unimaginable. You cannot sleep soundly. You can only monitor your body's temperature, perpetually waiting for the shiver that becomes too weak, the breath that becomes too shallow. Every slight headache, every dizzy spell, is interpreted through the lens of soroche. Is this just the altitude headache, or is this the beginning of HAPE, the high-altitude pulmonary edema that will fill my lungs with the deadly liquid? The physiological changes these people underwent over millennia, the very structure of their hearts and lungs, are monuments to environmental pressure. Yet they are still hostages to the night. We often romanticize ancient peoples, but here, in the 14th century Andes, life was a continuous, brutal calculation of energy output versus oxygen intake, played out in perpetual twilight. The subtle, agonizing pain of thawing tissue in the morning is just the price of having made it to dawn. It confirms that the battle was fought, and perhaps, by the narrowest margin, won. But the victory is fleeting. The sun, Inti, barely crests the glacial peaks before the preparations for the next inevitable, terrifying night must begin again. The cycle of extreme depletion and recovery is relentless. They are not just surviving, they are redefining the very limits of human endurance, trapped between the heavens and a vengeful earth, fighting a war that history barely remembers. And as the deep cold settles, and the stars above burn with impossible clarity, they wait, their bodies coiled tight, listening for the sound of the wind that whistles through the stones, the very breath of Pachamama, reminding them that they are merely temporary guests in her frozen domain. The true test of their will, however, is not the temperature outside, but the slow, corrosive despair that tries to convince them every single night that simply letting go would be easier. We must now look at the resources they used to fight back, the extreme adaptations in diet, and the horrifying ingenuity required just to keep the hearth warm for one more rotation of the merciless moon. The villagers of the high Andes knew that the war against Pachamama's icy breath could not be won solely beneath rough vicuña blankets. The true battleground was internal, a desperate struggle to ignite and sustain a roaring metabolic furnace that could withstand the nightly invasion of the sub-zero demon. This was not merely about eating. This was about weaponizing nutrition, about transforming the scarcity of the environment into concentrated explosive energy reserves capable of fighting the constant crippling drain of altitude sickness and hypothermia simultaneously. The centerpiece of this impossible diet was the humble yet mighty potato, the golden key to survival at 14,000 feet. But the potato, fresh and water-heavy, was a liability. The villagers needed something that defied decay, something that held its caloric promise indefinitely. Their ingenuity birthed chuño, a substance born from a horrifying collaboration with the mountain's own cruelty. The process was brutal. Spread the potatoes out on the frozen ground during the punishing overnight frost, allowing the ice crystals to rupture the cellular walls. The next day, under the intense, thin sun, the women and children would literally trample the tubers with their bare feet, squeezing out the now thawed water content and the bitter toxins. This was repeated for days, the potatoes shrinking into tiny, white, porous pebbles of near-pure starch. They were essentially freeze-dried, mummified carbohydrates, a 14th century superfood that could be stored for years, providing the dense, easily digestible glucose necessary to keep the heart pounding against the relentless pull of hypoxia. Without chuño, the entire village would have starved or frozen within a single harsh winter cycle. It was the white gold of the Andes, the fuel that kept the internal engines sputtering just above failure. Yet, a powerful engine needs external ignition, and here the desperation reached its most profound and arguably most degrading level. Above 12,000 feet, the great insulating forests vanished, leaving the settlements exposed to the naked fury of the elements. Wood, the universal currency of warmth, was simply non-existent. To keep the crucial hearth fire burning, to cook the chuño, and to provide the vital, smoke-filled air that helped prevent immediate death, the villagers turned to the only reliable fuel source available, takia. Takia is not a glamorous resource. It is the dried dung of the domesticated llama and alpaca. Imagine, for a moment, that your life and the lives of your children depend entirely on painstakingly collecting, drying, and meticulously rationing the fecal matter of your livestock. This wasn't merely fuel, it was the breath of the village, carefully piled high in protected niches, guarded more fiercely than any cache of precious metals. When the temperature dropped to -10 or -15 degrees Celsius, a single basket of takia represented the thin, flickering barrier between life and eternal night. The smoke was acrid, filling the low-ceilinged stone huts, causing chronic respiratory distress. But that smoke was life. It offered just enough heat and visibility to survive the 12-hour siege of the nightly cold. The need for takia dictated everything. Where they grazed their herds, the paths they walked, and the strict rationing protocols enforced by the elders. To waste a piece of dried dung was to invite the cold demon directly into your home. But even with the concentrated calories of chunyo and the precious, foul-smelling heat of takia, the villagers still had to face the physiological impossibility of functioning at such extreme altitudes. Their very bodies were monuments to extreme biological necessity, silent screamers against the thin air. Generations of high-altitude existence had left them with barrel chests and lungs capacity that dwarfed those of any lowland dweller. Their blood was thicker, dense with a superhuman concentration of oxygen-carrying red blood cells, a physiological adaptation that required monumental energy expenditure simply to maintain. Every breath was a struggle, every movement an effort multiplied tenfold by the scarcity of oxygen. Yet they carried on, fueled by one more crucial, chemically charged resource, the sacred coca leaf. Chewing the coca leaf was not a vice. It was pharmacological necessity, a direct line to survival. The gentle, sustained alkaloid release served several critical functions in the hostile high-altitude environment. It acted as a mild anesthetic, dulling the perpetual, crushing headache of hypoxia. Crucially, it suppressed the gnawing hunger pangs, allowing them to stretch their meager stores of chunyo just a little further. Furthermore, coca acted as a mild vasoconstrictor and stimulant, preventing the sudden, devastating drops in core temperature and providing the necessary mental clarity to perform high-stakes tasks, like tending the takia fire or checking on the vulnerable elderly when the body screamed for sleep and surrender. The coca leaf was the battery pack that kept the desperate, exhausted, hyper-adapted human machine running through the impossible, suffocating darkness, preparing for the moment when the vengeful sun would finally pierce the horizon and offer a temporary, fleeting reprieve. The sun had not yet arrived, and this, the blackest hour just before the dawn, was when the mountain truly came alive. It was the final, vicious test of Pachamama. The cold, not just a measurable temperature, but a palpable entity pressing down on every woven roof and chapped human lip. They called it the hour of the white silence because the cold was so absolute it stole the sound right out of the air, leaving only the frantic, rattling breath of those struggling to survive. Every muscle fiber was screaming, not from exertion, but from the systemic failure of the human machine trying to maintain 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit against an atmosphere that demanded death. The crude stone walls, built meticulously throughout the day, had now become conductors of catastrophe, bleeding the last vestiges of thermal energy back into the freezing void, betraying the very people they were meant to protect. This was the point of no return, the physiological tipping point, where the body's reserves were utterly exhausted. Inside the tiny, smoke-choked ichu, the sleeping nook carved into the earthen floor, the fire was nothing more than a stubborn, smoldering pile of dried llama dung and tough ichu grass, precious, agonizingly slow-burning fuel. It produced far more toxic smoke than actual heat, a deadly trade-off that was impossible to escape. But they had no choice. The altitude, hovering near the treacherous 14,500-foot mark, meant the oxygen molecules were already sparse, thin ghosts struggling to enter the blood. The smoke, heavy with invisible carbon monoxide, was the final, silent assassin, a cruel bonus delivered by the mountain itself. This sea latched on to the hemoglobin, replacing the meager oxygen, causing the dizzying confusion and the dull systemic headache that was just as much a part of their nightly ritual as the desperate prayer to the stars. Many a soul, exhausted by the endless battle, simply drifted off in this pre-dawn haze, mistaking the creeping suffocation for sweet, hard-earned sleep, never to wake when the light finally broke. That was the hidden terror of the Andean night. Death didn't always arrive with a dramatic frostbite crunch. Sometimes it came as a gentle, poisoned lullaby. The cold was a brute, but the air, or lack thereof, was the subtle executioner. Old Waina, the village elder, sat upright, a sentinel against the invisible enemy, refusing the deadly allure of rest. His face, etched with 100 high-altitude winters, was a roadmap of suffering, but his eyes were wide open, fighting the CO-induced drowsiness with sheer force of will. He carried the burden of the group's survival. He was the one who monitored the children's shallow breaths and made the agonizing decision of when to risk opening the smoke flap for a desperate gulp of fresh Hyperborean air, knowing that letting the cold in meant immediate, severe thermal shock to already weakened bodies. Every movement required a monumental, bone-grinding effort. The air was thick, heavy, and yet non-existent. It felt like breathing liquid stone, a physiological impossibility that they somehow managed every single night. They knew that if the fire died completely now, in this absolute 0 hour, they would have perhaps 90 minutes before irreversible hypothermia set in and claimed them all. 90 minutes to wait for a sun that felt like a legend, a story told to children, not a genuine celestial promise, due to arrive. The cold sought out the weak points with malice, the wrists, the exposed neck, the gaps in the tightly woven alpaca blankets. It was a thermal sniper, finding the tiny breaches in the defenses they had painstakingly erected against the mountain's relentless siege. Then, incredibly, impossibly, a shift. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was a subtle change in the darkness. The black wasn't absolute anymore. It had softened, turning to deep indigo. A shade that indicated the curvature of the earth was finally beginning to yield to the sun's distant, agonizing pressure. This was the moment of maximum risk and maximum hope. The instant where their physiological endurance was tested to its absolute limit before the relief could arrive. The human body, battered and bruised by the freezing night, had to find one last reserve of strength. They had to move, despite the crushing fatigue, despite the leaden quality of their limbs, before the sun hit the frozen fields. Why move before the sun? Because the instant the first ray struck the frozen ground, they needed to be ready for the daily miracle of the thaw and the subsequent duties, tending to the frozen stores, checking the animals, and, most critically, relieving the chronic mountain sickness that plagued them all. This disease, known today as Monge's disease, was a sinister consequence of prolonged high-altitude residency. Their bodies had become hyper-adapted, yet paradoxically, more vulnerable. Their blood was thick, viscous, sludgy, overloaded with too many red cells, trying desperately to capture non-existent oxygen. This thickness led to clots, strokes, and the debilitating headaches that hammered behind their eyes as the dawn approached. A medical crisis they simply accepted as the cost of living at the roof of the world. It was a race against their own internal physiology as much as the external frost.
They pushed through the heavy door flap, stumbling out of the poisonous smoke and into the terrifying, breathtaking beauty of the pre-dawn Andean world, where jagged peaks, silvered by ice, looked down like unforgiving gods, indifferent to their plight.
The air hit them, crisp, clean, but staggeringly cold. A shock to the system, but a lifesaver compared to the poisonous air inside the hut. The thin line of crimson fire on the eastern horizon was not a welcome mat. It was the starting pistol for the next grueling 16 hours of labor, followed immediately by the inevitable return to the suffocating darkness. The village had survived another night, but as they looked around at the hoarfrost covering everything, transforming the world into a deadly, glittering sculpture, they knew this was not a victory lap. This was just the intermission. The vengeful sun had arrived, yes, but the mountain was only resting, waiting for the shadows to lengthen, ready to unleash its cold fury again the moment the light failed. The brief burning day was not a gift from Inti, the sun god. It was a cruel calculation by the mountain itself. It gave the villagers just enough agonizing energy to move, to gather the sparse, brittle fuel needed for the next 9 hours of torture, but nothing more. This daylight truce felt like a cynical robbery, leaving them physically exhausted but spiritually empty, knowing the debt of survival was about to be called in again. The air, thin and hyper-transparent, filtered nothing. The UV light that scorched their exposed skin and cracked their lips also failed miserably at retaining any useful heat in the ground once the massive shadow of the Apu fell across the valley floor. They did not wait for the chill. They anticipated the catastrophe. They knew the very moment the shadow hit their village. The temperature would drop faster than a dying man's heart rate, a vertical, instantaneous plunge into instant hypothermia. This was the deadline, the final warning siren of the day, and it drove them into a frenzy of desperate preparation before the light failed completely. And so the desperate pilgrimage for fire began, not for food, not for water, but for fuel. Fire was the true currency of survival up here, worth infinitely more than gold or silver, and the only fuel available was the most pathetic, inadequate defense imaginable against the absolute zero of the Andean night, a mockery of warmth. They scoured the punishing, rock-strewn slopes for yareta, that incredibly dense, slow-burning cushion moss that took multiple human lifetimes, centuries, to grow its thick, resinous green carapace. Hacking out a handful of the slow-growing yareta felt like dismantling the mountain itself, a desperate geological crime against Pachamama that they paid for with aching lungs and blinding pressure-induced headaches caused by the sheer, unholy exertion at 14,000 feet. Most of the time, the yareta was too scarce, too far. They settled overwhelmingly for taquilla, dried llama and alpaca dung, carefully collected, pulverized, and stacked into rigid, vital cones of compressed desperation. This fuel source burned hot, yes, but it burned out fast, too fast, requiring constant, agonizing, and vigilant feeding throughout the night. Every piece of taquilla was counted, measured, and assigned a specific, terrifying lifespan. That small basket represented 30 minutes of fragile, smoky warmth. Maybe 40 if the wind didn't find the microscopic cracks in the mud brick walls of their rudimentary chulpa homes. If they miscalculated, if the reserves ran low, the mountain would simply walk right in and claim its due. But the day was not rest. Even in the light, their bodies were failing, processing oxygen at a criminally inefficient rate that demanded a permanent physical penalty. Every small muscle movement felt like lifting stones. Every breath was shallow and unsatisfying, forcing their hearts into a relentless, high RPM panic mode that aged them decades in a single year, thinning the walls of their endurance. The high-altitude sickness, the insidious soroche, was not just a headache, it was a permanent, dull-edged mental fog that made decision-making lethal. Should they risk climbing higher for the marginally better wood, or stay lower and conserve the precious little oxygen they had inhaled? The wrong choice meant death, a quiet, confused slipping away in the dark. Then came the inevitable, the shift in the planetary gears. The angle of the sun shifted, turning the brutal white light into a magnificent, horrifying orange spectacle that kissed the highest peaks goodbye with a final, deceitful glimmer of hope. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty here was just the flawless prelude to murder. The moment the last sliver of Inti vanished, poof, the temperature didn't just fall, it shattered. 20 degrees, 30 degrees, instantly. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate, like a switch had been flipped on the thermostat of doom, and the cold became a physical, pressing weight, squeezing the breath from their chests. The cold didn't seep in through the single narrow doorway. It exploded through it, driven by the violent hypoxic wind. Mothers rushed to seal the gaps, stuffing the cracks in the adobe with wet mud, woven straw, and anything else that could stop the enemy's advance. They were building a fortress against an assailant made of invisible molecules and lethal energy transfer. The most important defense, however, was not the fire or the walls, but the layers of thick, oiled alpaca and llama wool. The only reason they weren't frozen corpses within minutes of sunset. These textiles were their armor, their second skin, painstakingly spun and woven, absorbing the meager, fragile heat their bodies were desperately trying to produce. This was the wall of weaving, the ancient technology passed down through generations, holding the line between life and the mountain's eternal winter. But the true danger, the silent, efficient killer, was the floor. The earth itself, Pachamama's cold embrace, actively leached the heat downwards. They could not, under any circumstances, sleep directly on it. Reed mats, thick pelts, and several mandatory layers of woven cloth were placed down as sacred buffers against the ground that felt like solid, absolute zero ice, waiting patiently to suck the very life force from their bones through conduction. Night had fallen, and the hut immediately became a smoky crucible. The air inside grew thick and particulate from the burning takia, a dangerous trade-off between warmth and breathable air. Hypoxia was already setting in from the altitude. Now they were adding carbon monoxide to the deadly mix. Every hour, someone had to wake up, shivering violently, shaking off the paralyzing drowsiness of oxygen starvation, to check the failing flame, to gently blow life back into the embers, knowing absolutely that if the fire died, they died within the hour. Sleep was not rest. It was a high-stakes risk assessment. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the whistling wind trying to tear the thatch from the roof. That wind was Pachamama's relentless scream, an auditory torment reminding them that they were trespassers, tiny insects huddled against a mountain god waiting patiently, eternally, for them to fail. The long, terrifying 9-hour siege had just begun, and the air was already running out. The night was sentient, vengeful, and utterly unforgiving, and it had arrived once again to collect its daily toll. They had survived the heat, but now they faced the cold and the silence, the two true professional assassins of the high Andes. The air itself was turning crystalline, sharp enough to cut the lungs with every desperate, shallow breath they pulled from the impossibly thin atmosphere. Outside the small earthen dwellings of Kalpa, the wind began its nightly performance. Not a gentle breeze, but a snarling, predatory beast circling the perimeter, testing the mortar of every stone. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a crushing blanket of absolute zero, threatening to suffocate the flickering spark of life they desperately guarded. The temperature was dropping like a stone dropped from a cliff face, and the silence was the sound of the world holding its breath, waiting for them to fail. Inside, the fire, that flickering, defiant heart of human resistance, was already sputtering, a pitiful orange mockery against the crushing blackness. Every stick of tula scrub and every dried piece of takya, the precious llama dung fuel, was meticulously rationed, measured not in minutes of warmth, but in seconds of survival. To waste a single ember was to invite the professional assassins, cold and silence, right through the doorway, offering them easy passage to the inner sanctum of the home. The children were huddled tightest, cocooned in woven alpaca wool, their small chests rattling with the effort of breathing air that felt like water running uphill against an overwhelming pressure. This struggle was magnified by the unseen killer, hypoxia. Shivering, the body's primal defense mechanism burned astronomical amounts of energy and, critically, demanded more oxygen. Oxygen that simply was not there in the rarefied atmosphere of 14,000 feet. They were fighting a two-front war, simultaneously freezing from the outside and suffocating from the inside, their bodies locked in a self-destructive feedback loop of thermal demand and atmospheric starvation. The thick walls of the chulpas were their only defense, built by ancestors who understood the unforgiving contract they signed with this altitude. But even these massive thermal barriers were losing the battle. The stone wept condensation that froze instantly upon contact with the outer air, turning the exterior into a fortress of brittle ice, while the ground beneath their feet was a slab of ancient permafrost, leaking an invisible, deep chill that crept up the legs and seized the very marrow. This wasn't just physical discomfort. This was a war fought at the cellular level, a perpetual metabolic crisis. Every villager, even in the deepest, most exhausted sleep, was engaged in a relentless, exhausting process of thermogenesis, their bodies furiously attempting to generate heat while simultaneously struggling with an unpayable oxygen debt. Sleep here was a trick, a dangerous lapse in vigilance, where the boundary between life and the eternal freeze blurred, and the heavy, humid air of the coast seemed like an absurd, mythical luxury. Men and women woke frequently, gasping, their heads throbbing with the high-altitude headache, the infamous soroche. Pachamama whispering her corrosive promises of rest, promising an end to the painful struggle if they would just close their eyes one last time. It was approaching the darkest hour, the brutal pivot point of the night, usually around 3 hours before the first pale suggestion of dawn, the time when the temperature reaches its absolute nadir, a pitiless, paralyzing low. This was the moment of testing, where the weak fires would inevitably fail, and the true toll of the day's exertion would be paid in silent, agonizing, shivering fits that racked their bodies like convulsions. Elders watched the fire obsessively, feeding it microscopic portions of fuel, their eyes wide with the terror of knowing that once the last piece of takia was consumed and the fire died, they had perhaps 60 minutes of conscious, desperate struggle before hypothermia claimed them. They felt the cold as a conscious entity, not just a state of matter, but the icy, exhaled breath of the mountain goddess Pachamama herself, flexing her power, reminding these tiny specks of humanity how easily she could crush them back into the dirt from whence they came. Every slight crackle of the shrinking fire, every groan of the ancient roof beams was magnified into a scream of warning that echoed the desperation in their hearts. The psychological warfare was relentless. Doubt, despair, and the deep, paralyzing realization that they were entirely alone against an adversary that spanned continents and reached into the stars. Even their food was part of the thermal equation. They chewed on hard, freeze-dried potatoes, chuño, which required massive internal energy to digest, a desperate attempt to stoke the internal metabolic furnace, consuming their meager stores not for nutrition, but for pure, raw thermal calories to keep the vital organs running. The families pressed together, a primal, instinctive huddle of flesh against stone, sharing body heat that was more precious than any gold carried down from the warm valleys below. This enforced intimacy, this physical commitment to mutual survival, was their greatest weapon, a human wall against oblivion, a final, defiant act of community. But the sun was still hours away, trapped below the jagged horizon, oblivious to their mortal struggle above the clouds. They prayed to Inti, the sun god, begging him to climb faster, to puncture the frozen blanket of the night before the cold solidified their homes into an eternal tomb. They were survivors, not by inherent strength, but by sheer, mule-headed refusal to yield to the altitude. The descendants of generations who had learned to live where life was physically impossible. They were the people of the thin air, and for the 6th night of this brutal winter cycle, they held their breath, waiting for the dawn, knowing that the mountain had not yet finished its demanding, terrifying game. The fire was dying, and the silence was getting louder, pressing against the very eardrums of the huddled villagers. The final, fatal hour approached, and the air held the scent of frost and deep, existential dread. The moment had arrived. The clock of the cosmos, measured only by the creeping expansion of the ice crystals on the outer hide, declared the zenith of the frigid night. This was the hour the ancestors feared, the precise, agonizing window just before the sun dared to touch the peaks, when the thermal gradient was steepest and the breath became a dagger of pure ice. The air inside the tiny stone enclosure, already thin and poisoned by the fumes of burned ichu grass and dried llama dung, felt less like breathable atmosphere and more like a heavy, suffocating brine. Every exhalation was a surrender of precious, irreplaceable caloric energy, a debt paid to the silent, watchful mountain spirit, Pachamama, who demanded tribute in the form of human warmth.
Elder Cuscu, hunched against the shared wall of the hut, could feel the granite leaching the very heat from his spine. a parasitic transfer that no amount of woven alpaca wool could truly halt. His mind, already sluggish from hypoxia, began to play cruel tricks, showing him phantoms in the dark corners, twisting shadows cast by the dying embers of the concha fire pit.
He was deep in the throes of what they called kwawa, the high-altitude delirium, where the line between the waking world and the spiritual realm dissolved, blurring the terrifying reality with exaggerated shadows and whispers of impending doom. He saw the faces of those who had failed the night, the ones who had simply stopped breathing in their sleep, their visages imprinted on the smoky air. The greatest threat now wasn't the external, visible cold that crunched underfoot, but the internal collapse. It was the silent, creeping paralysis, known to the villagers only as the mountain's whisper, which lured the sleeper into a deep, final rest. This was the deadly tango of hypothermia, meeting the profound oxygen deprivation of 14,000 feet, a combination that systematically attacked the body's most vital systems until the will to sustain life simply vanished. For many, that jolt of panic never arrived. They simply slipped away, their metabolism slowing, their respiratory drive diminishing, until the delicate, fragile flame of life extinguished without a sound, making them permanent, frozen fixtures of the pre-dawn darkness. The village maintained a fragile, almost non-existent metabolic rate, conserving every joule of energy against the overwhelming deficit. Blood flow had retreated entirely from the extremities, leaving fingers and toes feeling like foreign, brittle objects, already belonging to the stone and ice outside. Even the necessity of life became a harbinger of death. Water, the sacred kocha, was now a solid, unforgiving shield of ice, requiring tremendous effort just to chip away and melt. The previous day's gathering of melted snow had already yielded its final moisture, leaving only brittle, razor-sharp shards in the clay pots. To venture out now, even for a moment, to chip away at the frozen stream bed or the communal reservoir, was to invite immediate doom. The sheer shock of the air at minus 20 degrees Celsius would instantly sear the exposed skin, and more lethally, the delicate lining of the lungs, transforming the respiratory tissue into frostbitten pulp, a painful, irreversible damage leading to inevitable high-altitude pulmonary edema. Every scrap of fuel was meticulously rationed. The dried takia, llama dung, the only viable, slow-burning heat source, but burned consistently at this altitude, was counted like gold coins. A single handful could mean the difference between life and death for the weakest child, and the sight of the diminishing pile was a constant, gnawing psychological pressure that overshadowed even the physical cold. They huddled closer, relying on the ancient instinctual knowledge of communal heat transfer, a desperate merging of bodies under the thick, woven timpi blankets, where the air trapped between the fibers became the last precious barrier against the void. This proximity, though vital for warmth, was also a devastating vector for sickness. The recycled, stale breath thick with microscopic threats, meant that if one person succumbed to the high-altitude respiratory infections that plagued the village, the whole cluster was immediately compromised. Survival demanded closeness, but closeness ensured shared risk, a devastating paradox of the high Andes that tested their faith in their community every single night. They were fighting for oxygen, fighting for heat, and fighting against each other's germs simultaneously. The villagers waited for the faintest, almost imperceptible lightening of the eastern sky. But the cold always seemed to intensify just before that blessed moment. It was Pachamama's final, savage test, squeezing the last remnants of vitality from her children before the sun god, Inti, arrived to offer temporary reprieve. The struggle became purely psychological now. The body was failing, the circulation was restricted to the core, and the extremities were numb, heavy anchors dragging them toward the earth. Survival ceased to be a physical act and became an act of sheer, furious will, a refusal to let the mountain claim them. Cusco clenched his jaw, forcing himself to count the slow, shallow breaths of his grandson beside him, using the rhythmic sound as a mantra against the hypnotic lure of unconsciousness. He knew the rules: stay awake, stay alert, and fight the urge to drift, because drifting meant never waking again. The minutes stretched into eons, heavy and dense, each tick of the cosmic clock demanding an impossible tax of endurance. The final, excruciating phase of the night had begun, and the village held its collective breath, waiting to see which souls the vengeful darkness would claim before the light returned. The battle was nearing its climax, and the silence was deafening. The silence, that crushing, absolute absence of sound, wasn't peace. It was the heavy, velvet shroud of the mountain god, Pachamama, drawn tight around their homes, suffocating the last whispers of hope and warmth. Every breath taken was a conscious, agonizing effort, a desperate transaction with an atmosphere that offered nothing but thin, poisoned drafts, a literal physical debt paid in sheer muscle strain and failing lung capacity. The villagers huddled so closely they could feel the rapid, frantic tremor of each other's hearts, hearts laboring against the viscous, non-oxygenated blood. Were now entering the darkest hour. This was the 4 a.m. witching hour, the nadir of the nightly cycle, when the Earth's core temperature offered its least resistance, and the ambient oxygen concentration dipped to its lowest, most lethal point. They were fighting not just the sheer physics of thermal transfer, where heat fled their bodies at impossible speeds, but the invisible thief that slipped into their minds, dulling their senses, whispering promises of rest that were actually invitations to the profound, terminal sleep of exposure. Sleep debt, accrued over months of interrupted, freezing nights, where survival was always prioritized over rest, was now manifesting as vivid, terrifying waking dreams and auditory hallucinations. A mother, her eyes wide with desperate exhaustion, swore she saw the spirit of a frozen ancestor standing guard by the door, skeletal fingers tracing patterns in the thick rime coating the stone walls. A specter of their inevitable future. A young boy, trembling uncontrollably in the arms of his father, believed the rhythmic crackle of the shrinking fire was actually the sound of the mountain's colossal grinding teeth, preparing to chew them whole and spit out the frozen remnants. This wasn't merely fear. This was the cognitive breakdown caused by chronic hypobaric hypoxia, amplified by the searing, deep bone pain of muscles perpetually clenched in an effort to generate heat that was immediately stolen away. Their bodies were cannibalizing themselves, shivering uncontrollably, a violent, rapid defense mechanism that ruthlessly depleted the last stored reserves of metabolic energy. The shivering itself had become a countdown clock, ticking down to the moment of exhaustion when the body would surrender. The internal furnaces would stop firing, and the paradoxical warmth of terminal hypothermia would set in. The body's core temperature, their most precious resource, was dropping below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, entering the danger zone where rational thought became impossible and the will to live began to crumble. The heart of the village, the central communal hearth, the sacred flame guarded since the sun's descent, was flickering dangerously low. Its existence was the only thing standing between them and total, immediate systemic failure. If the flame died, the psychological barrier against the cold would vanish, and panic would claim the weakened survivors before the ice did. The fuel, mostly dried llama dung, or takia, compacted into brittle cakes and supplemented by sparse bundles of high-altitude ichu grass, was running out at a terrifying rate, diminishing into gray ash with every passing minute. Takia burned fiercely, offering a brief, intense heat, but it was volatile and quickly consumed, leaving behind a sharp, acrid smoke that was barely breathable, but infinitely preferred to the sterile, freezing air outside.
Every handful of fuel was measured, weighed against the agonizing certainty that they would need to last another 3 hours before the sun could offer its treacherous, delayed relief. 3 hours where the cold would only intensify its grip. The fuel master, an ancient man named Kana, whose hands were scarred and blackened from a lifetime of handling the precious refuse, approached the dying ember like a high priest approaching a volatile deity.
His movements were slow, deliberate, conserving every precious calorie, his breath fogging even inside the tightly packed shelter. He had to feed it, but the remaining pile was pitifully small, enough for perhaps 20 more minutes of sustained warmth. Kana knew the iron rules of the high Andes: waste nothing, risk everything. He looked at the last precious cache of ichu grass, reserved not for heat, but for emergency kindling, the fuel of rebirth. Using it now meant that if the fire died completely, if the dampness of the stones or a sudden savage downdraft extinguished the core, they would have no means of starting over. It was the ultimate, necessary gamble against the mountain's cold efficiency. If the fragile flame was lost, the entire room, the entire settlement, would plunge into a terminal state of hypothermia within the hour. Kana didn't hesitate. With a grunt that cost him visible effort in the thin air, a sound more pained than words, He carefully layered the dry, brittle grass over the smoldering takia cakes, whispering ancient prayers for the persistence of combustion.
A glorious, terrifying surge of heat erupted, a momentary, defiant victory that made every person momentarily relax their shoulders, a reflexive action instantly regretted as the cold rushed in to fill the vacuum of warmth. The fire spat and crackled, throwing dancing shadows that looked like mocking, temporary demons on the stone walls, shadows that reminded them of the fleeting nature of their triumph. This brief burst of energy allowed them to see the true, terrifying state of their surroundings. The thick, crystalline layer of hoarfrost that coated the interior roof beams and the inner surface of the hides blocking the door. The way the moisture from their own breath instantly crystallized into ice particles on their sleeves and hair. The cold wasn't just physical anymore. It was a psychological pressure, a heavy, crushing blanket of dread that weighed on their chests, preventing them from drawing a full breath. They were experiencing what the elders called the false dawn cold, the moment just before sunrise when the atmosphere, in its final, desperate act, delivers its final, lethal blow, intent on harvesting those who were nearly spent. The villagers knew that true survival wasn't about enduring the initial shock of sunset. It was about outlasting this protracted, agonizing final assault, this siege of the spirit. They focused their entire, failing existence on the sound of Kana's slow, shallow breathing and the gentle, life-giving hiss of the burning takia.
Every sound outside their small stone shell was amplified and distorted by the absolute silence. The scrape of a small stone tumbling down the slope, the sharp, almost metallic crack of ice splitting on a nearby water source, sounds interpreted as the mountain stirring, stretching its icy limbs, preparing its inevitable final sweep. They were the last, defiant embers of human life against a universe designed to freeze them solid. The battle had not ended with the fire's resurgence. It had merely been bought another agonizing, impossibly expensive hour of existence. The true test of their will, the final, terrifying chapter of the night, was about to begin.
They waited, suspended between frozen death and uncertain daylight, knowing that soon the thin, fragile line separating the living from the eternal, frozen silence of Pachamama's unyielding grip would finally be tested to its absolute breaking point.